Hello and welcome back to the channel, and thank you so much for joining me on another of my interview series. Today I'm talking to a man a number of people of my viewers have been asking for, so diligently I have managed to track him down. Apparently he's off-grid somewhere in North California, so it's my great privilege to bring to everybody Dane Wigington. Now, before I bring him in, let me just tell you a little bit about Dane. I've got his bio here. It says here, Dane is the lead researcher and administrator for the website geoengineering watch.org and is the executive producer for the groundbreaking climate engineering documentary, The Dimming. He's background in solar energy and was a former employee of Bechtel Power Corporation. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and was a licensed contractor in California and Arizona. Dane's devoted the last 20 years of his life to a constant research on the issue of covert global climate engineering operations and the effort to expose and halt them. So that sounds very interesting. We know that our skies are dimming. We sense that. We see the aeroplanes going across and we see all these chemtrails. What's it all about? There's only one man to ask, and he's here. I'm very pleased to say, hello, Dane.
Hello, Richard. Thank you very much for the invitation and your willingness to investigate the global climate intervention issue.
Well, I think a lot of people are waking up to all sorts of things that have been going on, not least as a lot of people have been sort of saying, oh, what's going on in our skies? Are we being sprayed with stuff? Are they controlling weather? What is going on? So let's delve into that a little bit. I was impressed when you said you're living off grid. I think a lot of people these days would like to be well away from a lot of the things like 5G and things that are coming. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this, and then we'll find out what it is that is going on.
I grew up in a very smoggy Southern California, and it was my life's mission to get out of that. So when I eventually reached the wilderness of Northern California and built a large off-grid home, and that's part of what I did for Bechtel Power, was the alternative energy. I worked on some of the first commercial solar plants in the US in the middle of Mojave Desert. But upon reaching Northern California, completing this off-grid home with wind, hydro, and solar power being the primary power source, I was losing extraordinary amounts of solar power from whatever these aircraft were emitting, literally blocking out the sun. Some days, 70–80% of my solar power was lost because of what the aircraft were emitting. Now, that doesn't mean a 70 or 80% loss of visible light, but it means a loss of direct sunlight. And solar power does not function. PV panels don't function with that. So I began to research, found the issue of climate engineering, solar radiation management, which the stated purpose is to put light scattering particles into the sky to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy to slow down the warming of the planet. That's the stated purpose. And when I began to lab test my precipitation to see if some of these climate engineering elements were in the rain, indeed they were, starting with aluminum. And I was dismayed to find that. I'd hoped I wouldn't find that in my lab test. I continued testing, and the amounts kept going higher and higher and higher until within 18 months of the initiation of my testing, I had single rain events as high as 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum. And that's extraordinarily toxic rain. What was I to do, Richard, except to face this issue that was poisoning literally everything, including every breath I take. So that's what started me on this journey.
Wow, that's quite shocking to now. I know that there'll be a portion of the audience who already know the sort of basics. I'm coming to this completely fresh, so you'll have to excuse my naivety and, of course, my reactions if I'm slightly shocked by all of this. Is this? I mean, presumably, is this a deliberate thing, or is this just part of aircraft? The fact that it's flying around doing what they do, and it's a byproduct.
Very important question. No, this is not a byproduct of combustion. And in regard to the trails themselves, the condensation trail narrative, which is an absolutely false narrative, we have up-close film footage of these aircraft at altitude taken from another aircraft behind the aircraft being filmed, nozzles visible, turning on and off. End of the discussion. This is not condensation. And we know further, Richard, that all military tankers and all commercial carrier aircraft are fitted with what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That's a jet powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. It's designed for fuel efficiency. So that engine by design is nearly incapable of producing any, quote, condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. So again, if people don't believe what they see with their own eyes, in the film footage that we have at geoengineeringwatch.org under the jet spraying section, if they don't believe what they see with their own eyes, these up close film footage, nozzles visible turning on and off, there's nothing I can show or tell them that will make them face this issue. But the fact is, this is not condensation. These are sprayed payload dispersions of climate engineering elements: aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants. We now know from our most recent 100 lab test, even graphene is in the range. So this is a very toxic brew that's being dispersed as part of these operations.
Gosh. And is that going across all of the globe or in certain areas? Do we know?
The operations are global. Some areas are hit harder than other areas, depending on how the weather patterns function through those areas. For example, in Northern California, we're hit particularly hard because the weather for the country historically has moved through this region. It comes from the Pacific Ocean. So that seeding takes place as the moisture moves over the continent, if you will. So, and as far as global cooperation, this is very important. You can't just geoengineer over your own country without affecting the entire world. So there has to be global cooperation. In fact, there is. We have posted at geoengineeringwatch.org government documents, Senate documents. In fact, one particular Senate document, 800 pages long, going back to the late 70s, that outlines this global cooperation, even between otherwise adversarial nations. This document further calls for total blanket legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved with these programs, because once you disrupt the weather system, every single weather cataclysm then becomes suspect and a potential liability.
So presumably, so let me go back. How long has this been going on for?
We know from historical data that these programs were first deployed at scale over the polar regions immediately after World War II. So, Richard, you may remember seeing all the film footage of the World War II bombers leaving massive condensation trails, correct?
Yes.
You've seen this, I'm sure, in film footage. Many people bring this up. We found on U.S. military archival footage, we found film footage of one B-17 filming others in formation above them, some leaving massive trails, others leaving nothing, and one directly above the filming aircraft, leaving a massive plume, was shut off instantly in air as if it was cut with a knife. That plane didn't fall out of the sky. Its engines didn't die. It was clearly dispersing something. They would have had to have been beta testing in World War II in order to deploy immediately after World War II. And we had other aspects of climate engineering that were first stated on the record after World War II. For example, Project Cirrus, the U.S. military's effort to manipulate hurricanes, started in 1947. So the bottom line is all these puzzle pieces connect perfectly. In regard to aluminum, we had Stanford University reporting in their polar studies, they were seeing a polar haze that had aluminum particulates in it, and they couldn't figure out where that was coming from. So again, we have all of these elements fitting together perfectly, and certainly, why would we expect that they wouldn't do this? Would they ask our permission first? I think not. Did they ask our permission to detonate 2,400 nuclear bombs without public consent? And they did that. And certainly we know there's so many other items in this category that they don't ask for public permission for anything they do they?
No, absolutely. So there's no way, because as soon as you start mentioning this to anybody, people who are skeptical, I suppose because they believe that, or the world has made them think that it would be absolutely impossible for something like this to happen. It would be so far-fetched that it seems barking. And so their argument is, of course, it's vapor trails. So let's just deal with that. Do aircraft, leave what we see as those very clear in the sky twin vapor trails as they go across?
We're going to ask people to exercise their own sense of reason. And how would you see on a day where you might see an aircraft leaving these trails. And again, we have up close photographs as well of the nozzles, retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons, aimed into the exhaust jet stream to make this look like condensation.
Hmm.
But it doesn't take a lot of deductive reasoning to say, well, why is there a grid pattern in the sky one day, nothing the next? If you observe closely, and we can from my remote location because we can hear these aircraft, there's no other noise pollution. And you can see one aircraft leaving a trail from horizon to horizon next to another aircraft, same altitude, same category of aircraft, leaving nothing.
Right.
And again, the film footage up close of the nozzles visible turning on and off is very telling. And let's add this to the equation. We have virtually the entire global climate science community and governments all over the world stating that we need to geoengineer. That's the science term for this. And I encourage people, if they're trying to research this or bring the issue up to others, use the science terms. That brings credibility. Climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection. But under all these categories, what these involve or entail is aircraft spraying nanoparticle dispersions into the sky to mimic the cooling effect of a volcano to provide temporary cooling for the planet. That's the definition of solar radiation management. And again, every single puzzle piece we already have. But the entire global climate science community is calling for these programs to be deployed immediately to avert planetary cataclysm, when in fact, after 75 plus years of these programs ongoing, we know it's already fueled cataclysm, not mitigated it. But isn't it absurd, Richard, that we have, again, governments around the globe, official agencies, elected officials, climate scientists calling for putting jets in the air to spray dispersions exactly like what we see with the exact elements that are showing up on the ground, and yet they pretend that this is some sort of wild conspiracy theory. Is that not absurd?
Well, it certainly sounds completely absurd. I was going to ask you whether they deny that this is happening, and we'll get on to who they are, really, but presumably science... I mean, clearly you're not the only one who's observed all of this and thought, hang on, there's something a bit dodgy going on, and taken measurements and studied it. There must be people across the world who are clamouring for this, if only it was just dimming the skies, but also presumably these particles, like aluminum, or aluminium as we would say, is dangerous for health, extremely dangerous. So my question is: there must be scientists who are clamouring to say, please don't do this. Why are you doing it? And where is the rebuttal?
Okay, you are correct on every level. First, there are increasing amounts of pushback from the climate science community stating this would be a horrific idea. We shouldn't do this, but still pretending that it isn't ongoing. In regard to aluminum, or aluminium, as you would call it, you are completely correct again. It is harmful, extraordinarily harmful to all life forms, period. And although aluminum, and this is the sort of skepticism you see from some, aluminum or aluminium is a very prevalent element in the Earth strata, and some claim we should expect to see it everywhere. That is patently false. Freeform aluminum, key term, freeform aluminum, does not exist naturally in the environment, period. In order for it to be freeform, it must have been mined and refined and dispersed. And in fact, that is exactly what we are finding. And we took this to the degree of, we spent an extraordinary amount of resources with extraordinary effort. Our team at geoengineeringwatch.org took a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab with top scientists in it to altitude and sampled what heavy aircraft were emitting in our skies. We processed that sample at Rinster Polytechnic University, one of the world's most renowned, found exactly what we knew we would find: climate engineering elements starting with aluminum. So again, this is all available on the geoengineeringwatch.org groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming, which we posted for free the moment it was done. And in regards to those who claim there would be whistleblowers everywhere if this was going on, not true. One, these programs are highly compartmentalized. Would we expect that the US military pilots in Vietnam that were spraying Agent Orange were told that this will kill your comrade on the ground? Of course they weren't told that. They were all compartmentalized. And two, we have an illegal federal gag order, Richard, on the nation's weathermen in the United States. National Weather Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have an illegal federal gag order on them. Why would the government do that if there wasn't something extraordinary to hide?
Yes, absolutely. So, do we know who is responsible for this?
Ultimately, all roads lead to the central bankers, those who print the money. This is why the fight right now for the dollar as the global reserve currency in the United States is going down in flames, because the rest of the world has had enough of the US dollar hegemonic power. And so, but again, when they can fund whatever they want with as much resources as they want, and the Pentagon officially is missing, I believe, that we know of, about $31 trillion since the late 90s. Where did they get that additional 31 trillion, let alone to have it go missing? Again, they've been able to print whatever they want for whatever they want. And the planet and its people have wrought the consequences of that. That's why the U.S. has a military machine that's bigger than the next 10 biggest militaries combined. And the result of that, what we see now, and their ability to, and this is an important part of climate engineering that people need to understand, their ability to create surface cool downs with what's called chemical ice nucleating elements. So what we have, it's happening right now in the US. It's been happening over decades, but it's happening right now. It's a stunning example of it. We have areas in parts of the northern states of the US that have gone from snow to 90 plus degrees, record shattering highs, 10 degrees above the former all-time record, and they're going back to snow this week. Try to imagine that. Again, I'm talking about Fahrenheit, of course, but from snow to record-shattering midsummer high temperatures and back to snow in a week. Wow. That's geoengineering. That's from climate engineering. And they can, when they spray, Richard, have you seen mountains that have the ski slope is covered with snow, but the whole mountain is bare? You've seen that before, probably, right?
Yes.
So this is that on a much larger scale. And when they seed the clouds with what's called chemical ice nucleating elements, and these are patented processes, it creates what's called an endothermic reaction, an energy absorbing reaction. And that creates a cold air mass that descends to the surface because the cold air is more dense. And this chemical reaction can nucleate what should have been a liquid precipitation event, i.e. a rainstorm, into a frozen precipitation event. So, and I ask people to consider their first aid kit that might sit on their shelf for 20 years at room temperature. If you mix the cold pack together, the chemicals that are in a cold pack in a first aid kit, ice instantly. And that's what this is on a much larger scale, highly toxic, but this is literally engineered winter. And the Chinese government openly announced they were doing this. Your listeners can search Chinese government engineer snowstorm. Fox News covered it, Popular Science, MSNBC, ABC. But yet, if it's brought up here, suddenly you're marginalized.
So, I mean, what you're describing is and as we've seen, how there is this race to put everybody on a certain one power, electricity, to take away independent power, such as wood-burning stoves, which we're sort of planning in the UK, take away heat pumps and, not heat pumps, gas, and replace them with heat pumps. And then if you're saying that effectively you could create winter whenever they damn well like and keep people cold, and they can then turn off the electricity so you can't heat your house, that's an enormous amount of control over millions of people worldwide.
You're absolutely correct. Let me make this point abundantly clear. Although the climate science community those that are for climate engineering would pretend this is something benevolent, that could not be further from the truth. Climate engineering in all its forms is about power and control, period. So if we go back, and I'll finish answering your question in a moment, but let's go all the way back, the beginning to every weekly geoengineeringwatch.org on-air radio update. It's called Global Alert News. We post that for free at geoengineeringwatch.org. We pay for that airtime out of pocket on 22 radio stations around the country. That's 1 hour of the most dire data that we face, the most dire threats we face. But at the beginning of that broadcast, it's key. There's a it's about a 15-second clip of former U.S. President Lyndon Johnson in 1962 on film, on the record, stating that we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then in 1962, 61 years ago.
Wow.
And that quote, he who controls the weather controls the world. His words, not mine. So they can shut off precipitation to agricultural regions, which they are absolutely doing. We're not guessing. We can see their operations on satellite imagery. They can flash freeze crops, which they just did in California for the 6th year in a row. They allow the temperatures to force early blooms, and then they flash freeze everything with a chemical surface cool down. This is not an accident. We see it happening around the globe via either hail, drought, flash flooding, but they're hitting ag regions very, very rapidly. In regard to the flash surface cooldowns, we've seen instances so extreme, Richard, that in fact in the U.S. on October 4th, 2013, in South Dakota, there was a flash snowstorm. Now, has anybody heard of a flash snowstorm before? A flash snowstorm that killed 100,000 cattle. And it started snowing at 40 degrees. Why is it snowing at 40 degrees, which would be 3 or 4 degrees C, something like that?
Right.
Why would it snow at that temperature? And at the same time, not far away in Kansas City, it was 89 degrees and raining. In Chicago, further north, it was 85 degrees and raining. How could there possibly be on October 4th a flash snowstorm that killed 100,000 cattle, and they were laying around in the mud 2 days later, dead, no snow, everything melted? We have extreme circumstances in South America. Same, 250,000 alpacas, cold hardy alpacas, killed from the same type of flash snowstorm. And again, these are patented processes. We have those patents at geoengineeringwatch.org. We're not guessing.
Mm. This is so. If these particles are in the air, here's the thing that I always sort of come back to. Surely it's also going to be damaging those people who are paying for this. Presumably they're still breathing this in, even So it can't. I'm trying to sort of square a circle here in which the people who are orchestrating it must be affecting them. They can't be living in gas masks or other things.
Extraordinarily important question. Why would they do this to themselves?
Yes.
And I would point out an example I mentioned a moment ago. The detonation of 2,400 nuclear bombs all over the world contaminated virtually all life on the planet. And we have a power structure that's addicted to power. Does an addict care that the next fix might kill them? Does a cancer care that its unchecked proliferation will eventually kill the host? No. A cancer's objective is to spread and proliferate until the host eventually dies. It's a consequence. So again, we have nuclear power plants, Richard. Fukushima may be an extinction level event by itself. There's no technology to fix it, no end in sight. We have Chernobyl that will likely be a meltdown event again because the sarcophagus is disintegrating. And yet in spite of that, we have those in power building 60 more nuke plants right now on top of the 440 that already exist. It takes 2 to 3 decades to cold shut down a nuclear power plant. When societal collapse occurs, we're going to have Fukushima times several hundred. Next, climate engineering is also destroying the ozone layer. The ozone layer is not recovering, as we've been told, and now there's recent data as of a week ago to again corroborate what geoengineeringwatch.org has said for well over a decade, because we're metering UV radiation on the surface, which is a direct indication of ozone deterioration. We're getting UVC on the surface. That's a DNA damaging spectrum of UV radiation. It's killing plankton, killing insects. And climate engineering is absolutely the core causal factor, not hairspray cans, as we were told. Yeah. So the bottom line is here we have yet another existential threat directly connected to climate engineering. And back to the nuclear plants, if I can weave all this together. Our now damaged atmosphere has made us very susceptible to a CME, coronal mass ejection, solar flare. If we have a major event like the Carrington event that happened in the 1800s, that would shut down grids all over the world. That would prevent nuclear power plants from being able to cool themselves. Again, Fukushima times several hundred, perhaps, game over. And yet they're doing this anyway. So again, we face a cancer, a headless, heartless, soulless cancer, each part trying to protect its own interest, but with no consideration of the consequences. And a final note, if you look at psychoanalysis straight from scientific study of those in power and their mental traits, there's a common thread. And that common thread is this: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. We're dealing with a cancer.
You paint a very bleak picture that it seems there is no escape from if it continues. And we're, as you said already, that we're already affected by this. I mean, I've been around nearly 60 years on this planet, and I've now learnt that all those 60 years I've been subject to some form of this nasty stuff. And it probably explains a hell of a lot of ill health for a lot of people, perhaps mental health, breathing metal particulates into the going into the bloodstream, getting into the brain, and all of those sort of things, and all of that. Is there? It says on your thing that you're fighting this. What hope have we got, and what tools have we got to stop it? And is there a positive future to look forward to? Or a glimmer?
If I could back up to one more, I'll answer that question in a moment. If I could back up to one more aspect of those in power, they do have access to medical treatments that the common public does not have access to. That involves chelation of the blood. We've interviewed one individual that has been to this facility, one in Germany, where the blood is cycled through the body into chelation technology that purges the heavy metals from the blood. And that type of treatment, perhaps once a year, would exempt them from many of the symptoms that the rest of us will deal with. Because you're correct, these bioavailable elements, the smaller the particle, the more harmful it is, the more bioavailable, the more your system absorbs it and can't get rid of it. So every person we've tested, hair, blood, urine, is packed with these metals, starting with aluminum, and it affects every part of our body's neurological system, immune system, everything. But those in power would have a means of at least mitigating some of those symptoms through that type of chelation, which is not available to the rest of us. As far as our overall picture, what we can do, this is imperative for people to face, that however dire the horizon is, if we don't face it fully, we have no chance of dealing with it. If you're standing in the middle of the freeway at rush hour, are you better off facing traffic or turning your back to it and hoping for the best?
Right.
So I think that answer is clear. So we can't know in regard to the climate or the state of the climate, and we certainly have a very damaged planet at this point. But from any perspective, from any viewpoint on the state of the climate, how can we have any legitimate discussion about it without addressing this first? And we've seen extraordinary hypocrisy from the so-called environmental groups that will not address, will not acknowledge, will not admit to this single most damaging human activity of all. And we feel that is criminal. It's inexcusable. And they're trying to protect their 501 nonprofits so they don't address this issue. We know that because our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org have communicated with their attorneys. They don't want to lose their 501, so they don't want to address this issue. And that's simply not acceptable. So if we can stop this interference with the planet's life support systems, then we can assess where we're at. Until we stop this, we can't. And we can say mathematically, statistically, if these programs continue unabated, and they involve not just the spraying of these toxic particles, Richard, but also the manipulation of these particles with extraordinarily powerful frequency transmissions from ground-based facilities. You've heard of HARP, perhaps, in Alaska?
Yeah, vaguely, yes. Yeah, vaguely.
I encourage your listeners to search that, HAARP. That's the acronym. It's and if they search that and look at that facility, that is literally a weapon of mass destruction that is capable of transmitting millions of watts of power into the ionosphere. This is part of climate engineering operations, part of how they steer upper level wind currents. That can transmit millions of watts of power into the ionosphere, create an electrical chain reaction that heats that level of the atmosphere to extraordinarily high temperatures. And that can cause a high pressure heat dome. You've probably heard the meteorologists refer to a heat dome in recent years. And that's part of that operation. There are also ground-based facilities that manipulate these particles. So when you saturate the atmosphere with electrically conductive particles, they then become susceptible to manipulation with frequency transmission. So all of that's bombarding us, not just the absorption of these materials, but the frequency transmissions, which are far stronger than the communications transmissions that so many are fighting, justifiably so. So back to, again, if we can this interference with the Earth's life support systems is so profound, so total, that we can't truly assess the state of the climate. We know it's damaged, but we can't assess what the planet will do, how it will respond until or unless we stop these programs.
So the question is, how do we stop the programs?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was mean to skip that. This is how people like you that are helping to get this out in the open so that those participating, including in the military, including defense industry personnel, including their families, so that they realize they are literally participating in their own near term, I can't express that enough, near term demise. And
Right.
at that point, we have a chance of stopping these programs from the inside out. It is our only chance, I would argue. If we can get this into the open and populations around the globe understand what their governments have done to them without their knowledge or consent, that every single weather cataclysm, and how could we begin to quantify how many there are? It's now every day all over the world, that every one of those events is now a liability for governments involved. Because would that event have happened at that place at that time without these programs? And the answer is likely no, because they've disrupted the entire system. So if we can, again, get this out in the open so people realize not just the weather cataclysm, but every breath they take is laden with these particles. And to put that into perspective, we talked about the damage earlier, but the amount of particles we're inhaling, based on recent science study, we are inhaling as many as 20 million nanoparticles with every breath we take. Try to imagine that. That sounds impossible, but consider that you can fit 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a human hair. 100,000. And we have quantified, based on testing with one of the world's most renowned agricultural institutions, the amount of material in the precipitation over that particular state, if extrapolated around the whole globe, it looks as if the data indicates that they are dispersing somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 million tons of these particles into our skies annually. That's inconceivable. It's changing soil pH values. It's killing soil microbiome, which is killing forests. That's killing crops, sterilizing soils. This is a fight for life. That's why I'm focused on this issue, because it is the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat at this moment. Greatest threat we face short of nuclear cataclysm. If we don't deal with it, we're done.
During the lockdown, we had a year, I suppose, on and off with different different states, different countries closing down at different periods. Presumably, and we saw the aeroplanes weren't flying as frequently. Was there a dip in the amount of these particles going into the atmosphere as a result of that? Can we actually see on a graph that there was, or were they still flying and we didn't know?
They were in many regions still there. Now, again, there was definitely a measurable alteration in some regions. It's the same thing after 9/11, when all the aircraft were grounded in the U.S. after 9/11.
Yeah.
We that was measured statistically. We saw daytime temperatures go up, which we would expect without these particles in the atmosphere. And we saw nighttime temperatures go down for the same reason. And that's key to understand the flaw of these programs, the very premise of these programs to block some of the daytime thermal energy input. You trap that heat at night, negating right. any stated positive effect. And we now know from the most recent science study that the entire premise for solar radiation management to mimic the cooling effect of volcanoes is completely flawed. Because even in the case of a volcanic eruption, it causes only temporary toxic cooling at the cost of a near-term worsened warming because of the damage to the atmosphere, because of the trapped heat, everything that we see, disrupted rainfall patterns. When you put all these particles in the air, you completely disrupt hydrological cycles. So again, the whole premise for this is completely flawed, completely false. This is being used as a weapon, period. And if I could give one more example to the weapon part, Richard, this is important. Right after 9/11, we had the NATO Supreme Commander, General Wesley Clark, was given a list of Middle Eastern countries that the U.S. military intended to target. Subsequently, every single one of those countries underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. Statistically, mathematically, that would be impossible to have that kind of consistency unless there was a factor in this equation that we weren't being told about. That factor is climate engineering, aka weather warfare, and to that destabilized their food production, thus destabilized their populations, thus made those countries easier to manipulate, invade, occupy. And in the case of some of those countries, Iran, for one, they their president, their leader, went to the floor of the UN and stated such that NATO was cutting off their precipitation, stated it on film, on the
Right.
record. And we saw none of that here. So this is simply weather warfare, and it's been going on. If we look at Project Popeye in Vietnam in the 60s, matter of historical record, the U.S. was so successful at manipulating rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail that by the 70s, the international community passed INMOD treaties, environmental modification treaties, forbidding weather manipulation for wartime. Not that anybody paid attention to that, but this is all historical record. So for those who want to pretend this is some wild conspiracy theorist, that's just people that simply don't have the courage to face the truth.
Mm. So if you were waging war, let's say two nations were waging war against one another, I can't think that anything would be happening like that at the moment. A great big continent could be possibly doing anything. But in a way, you wouldn't need to have troops on the ground and people doing that if you've got the ability just to shut off and destroy a country's food supply. Let's say a country was, I don't know, known as a breadbasket of the world and was producing most of the wheat, or in a vague scenario, just for YouTube's terms and conditions sort of thing. You wouldn't need to have troops and tanks and people being shot at and all of that, because you could easily control them that way, which then makes you think, well, if that's possible, I wonder what's the story there going on if that's just all theatre to distract us all. It seemed, as you say, because this is an incredibly powerful weapon, but who controls it? It's obviously, as you said, a global control who are all agreeing on all of this, and so it's controlled by a very small number of people at the end of the sort of the pyramid, I guess.
You are completely correct on all points. And to back into that, there's a U.S. military document. Your listeners can search this online as well. It's called Owning the Weather in 2025. They are certainly there already. But in that document, what it calls weather manipulation, climate engineering, weather warfare, as a force multiplier, that you can bring populations of countries to their knees without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault. You can destabilize those governments by the same means. And there is absolutely no question this is going on, because we can see their operations on satellite imagery. And let's, as far as the so-called forecasters, let's just put that into context. For example, in Northern California, we have our local forecasters, which are simply weather manipulation script readers. They know sometimes 6-7 days in advance if a particular day will be what they call now mostly sunny. And on that day, when they use that term, it's typically there's not a natural cloud anywhere in the sky, but there is jet sprayed haze. And that's exactly what it is, because we have time-lapse footage. You can see this spreading out, covering the entire horizon, blotting out the sun. How could that so-called weather forecaster know that 7 days in advance unless they're reading a script? And we know they're reading scripts because Raytheon, private defense contractor Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin do all the weather modeling for the nation's weathermen, the agencies that are under a federal gag order that I just mentioned. And that script goes all the way down to the local meteorologists. They are literally reading scripts.
Heavens, this is so scary. I'm so pleased to have been able to talk to you about this, Dane. You're saying the solution really is ground up, from the ground, yes. Getting people to be aware of this, to talk and share it, to go to your site, geoengineeringwatch.org, to do as much research as possible, but persuade people. I made a video a month or two ago called Don't Build the Prison. And that was about people putting in the 5G, or we have cameras that are going to do the biometrics. And the people who are doing the work for the dastardly, nasty people don't necessarily know they're doing the work, or they're a small element of it. And without those workers doing what they do, the big network couldn't happen. And so I was saying, well, if you're going to build it, because people have got to have work, they've got to do the job. I was saying, well, if you've got to put in these sodding cameras and this 5G, make sure you add in a slight thing where you can nobble it when the time comes, because these people are basically building the prison, and once they realize that's what they're doing, or in this instance they're all contributing to poisoning the air and causing the bad weather and bringing us down to our knees, if we're able to persuade those that what they are doing is an element of that, they are likely to stop. And if enough of them stop, it stops.
Yes. And again, the key aspect, if we can get this out into the open, I would argue at that point, we have the proverbial pitchforks and torches time, when the population takes to the streets looking for anyone and everyone involved with the programs and their cover up to hold them legally and morally accountable. In regard to our so-called elected officials, they are bought, sold, and paid for. I've had personal meetings at the Capitol of California with Governor Newsom, his top aide, and they absolutely could not dispute these programs were in existence, but they have said exactly nothing, nor will they, because that's part of their servitude to those in power. And the gravity of this issue, again, it cannot be overstated. It is not just destroying in the near term the planet's life support systems, soils, waters. It's contaminating every single breath we take. And our systems are already overburdened with toxins, and there's many sources. I'm not blaming everything on climate engineering. I want to make that clear. We've been horrible stewards of the planet. There's no question about that. We have trashed the planet. But the intentional disruption of the planet's life support systems being the most egregious of all, and mathematically and statistically, if we don't deal with this, again, we're done. And if you look at things like the destruction of the ozone layer, for example, that by itself being an extinction level event, we have recently gotten peer-reviewed study of, for example, plankton populations from the Atlantic crashed, 90% decline. UV radiation is the single biggest factor, aside from all the pollution, the plastics, everything else. UV is killing plankton as they try to photosynthesize in the upper layers of the water column. They're being fried, literally, just like insects are as well. So we take even one aspect of that as an extinction level event. Now let's add everything else on top of that. Again, this is a fight for life. And if we don't deal with it, statistically, mathematically, we are at the end of the road. But if we can expose it, we would alter the entire paradigm. And every one of us can play a part in that. And any one of us could be the final, as I state in the end of the film, The Dimming, any one of us could be the final pebble that triggers the landslide of awakening. And if we can do that, it would be the most quantum leap we can make in the right direction.
The Dimming is your documentary. It's available on your website. People can go and see that, as you said, for free. People could go and visit geoengineeringwatch.org to find out more. Dane, it's been an absolute privilege. Thank you for making time to talk to the viewers and myself. And I hope the viewers watching this have been able to take it in and think about it. Go and do a bit of research. Don't just take our words for it. Look it up. And push the message if you go along with it, which I think, looking at your website and all of what you've said, it's pretty frightening, and we probably haven't got a lot of time, which is a story that keeps coming down us at the moment. Do you feel that we're at a tipping point at the moment now?
No, we're past the tipping point. The reality we've known is done. It's not coming back. But does that mean we don't fight to salvage what we can?
Right.
It doesn't mean that. We have an obligation. It's not just an option. It's an obligation to fight to salvage what we can. And those in power are extraordinarily desperate at this point because they can't hide the totality of what's unfolding for much longer. And at that point, and this is critical for your listeners to understand, they are capable of who knows what. And I want to clarify that in this mix that we know is in our precipitation, that includes not just the heavy metals, but polymer fibers and graphene. Those two elements specifically can be used militarily in biological warfare as biological carrier platforms. What's that mean? It means they can be used to carry a pathogen from the clouds to the ground. We know that the second most recognized climate engineer, Dr. Ken Caldera, that was a former U.S. Department of Defense scientist, we own an audio at geoengineeringwatch.org of him stating what he did for the U.S. Department of Defense was to design ways of spraying pathogens into clouds to infect the population below. He works for Bill Gates now, interestingly enough. So again, why would we think that at some point, if they become too desperate, they wouldn't use these platforms to disperse something like Marburg or Ebola, and which would completely level the playing field in short order? So I can't express enough the
gravity of
the gravity of this to expose what's happening in our skies and bring it to a halt. And so this fight involves all of us. Again, every one of us could be any one of us could be the final factor here that reaches a critical mass of awareness. And we at geoengineeringwatch.org, our links can be shared online. We encourage that. Facebook's tried very hard to censor us. We actually had a lawsuit involved with that. So it's sharing from a personal email, sharing the links. We need all the help we can get. And if we can reach a critical mass, we will change this equation.
Brilliant stuff. Well, let's end on that hopeful note to keep people up and positive. I'm sure people will certainly take note of that and do as much sharing as possible. Thank you, Dane, so much. I really appreciate you coming on the show and you know, telling us the gravity of this situation. Everywhere we turn at the moment, there seems to be things, but we've got to be brave and we've got to be strong and we've got to do it. There's just no other choice.
The honor is mine, Richard. Thank you very much for your willingness to address this most dire issue. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Do check out geoengineeringwatch.org. A big thanks to Dane for talking to us today. I will be back with more interviews coming up. But please go and investigate this, because as you breathe, you're breathing in this rubbish and we don't want it. Take care, Dane. Thanks very much, viewers. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.